Arrogant CEO falls for a poverty-stricken maid. His mother's reaction is jaw-dropping. The grand ballroom of the estate glittered under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Rows of polished silverware gleamed atop white-clothed tables, and the air hummed with a low murmur of conversation, punctuated by bursts of laughter. Alexander strode into the room, his tailored suit fitting him like a second skin. He moved with the confidence of someone who had always been told the world belonged to him. Clara, stationed discreetly at the back of the room, worked quickly but quietly, her apron tied neatly around her waist. She darted between tables, refilling glasses and picking up stray plates, doing her best to remain invisible. That was how she preferred it, to blend into the background, unnoticed by the wealthy guests she served. But Alexander noticed her. It wasn't the first time Clara had caught his attention. Something about her stood out, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way her hands moved with precision, or the quiet determination in her eyes. Whatever it was, it irritated him. He didn't like being distracted. As she passed by his table, her tray balanced with practiced ease, one of the guests gestured for her attention. In her haste to reach them, her elbow brushed the edge of Alexander's champagne flute. The glass tipped precariously, spilling a splash of golden liquid onto the pristine tablecloth. Alexander's head snapped toward her, his sharp glare cutting through the air like a knife. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he demanded, his voice low but dripping with disdain. Clara's cheeks flushed a deep crimson. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said quickly, reaching for a napkin. Her hands trembled slightly as she dabbed the spill, her eyes fixed on the table. "Sorry doesn't clean this up," Alexander snapped, his irritation growing. "Do you even know how much this tablecloth costs? Or this champagne, for that matter?" Clara didn't respond. She knew better than to engage with someone like him. Instead, she straightened up, clutching the tray tightly to steady her nerves. "I'll fetch a replacement," she said softly before hurrying away. From across the room, Victoria, Alexander's mother, watched the scene unfold with narrowed eyes. She made a mental note to address Clara's mistake later. The help, after all, was supposed to remain invisible, not cause disruptions. Later that evening, as the guests mingled and the music swelled, Alexander found himself wandering toward the library. The party was still in full swing, but he needed a moment of quiet. The clinking glasses and superficial laughter had begun to grate on him. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, the rich scent of leather-bound books and polished wood filling the air. To his surprise, the room wasn't empty. Clara was there, stacking glasses on a tray with meticulous care. She looked up when she heard the door, her expression wary. "I'll just be a moment," she said, quickly returning her attention to her task. Alexander frowned. "Do you always hide in the library during parties?" Clara paused, her hands hovering over the tray. "I'm not hiding," she said, her tone even. "I'm working." "Working?" Alexander repeated, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "It seems like you're always working." "That's what I'm paid to do," Clara said simply. Her calm reply irritated him even more. "And do you enjoy it?" he pressed. "Serving people who don't even see you?" Clara's gaze flicked up to meet his. For a moment, Alexander saw something in her eyes he hadn't expected, a quiet strength that challenged him. "It's honest work," she said, "and it pays the bills. That's more than I can say for some." Alexander stiffened, her word hitting closer to home than she could have known. "Careful," he said, his tone cold. "You might want to think twice before insulting your employer." Clara didn't flinch. "I wasn't talking about you, sir," she said evenly. "But if the shoe fits..." Before Alexander could respond, she picked up the tray and walked past him, leaving him standing alone in the library, unsure whether to be angry or impressed. Alexander stood in the library long after Clara had left, her words echoing in his mind. It wasn't often that someone spoke to him with such directness, let alone someone from the staff. He wasn't sure if he felt annoyed or intrigued. Either way, she'd managed to leave an impression. The next morning, Alexander found himself lingering around the estate's kitchen. He told himself it was to grab a coffee, but he knew it was more than that. Clara's resilience, her refusal to cower under his condescension, had piqued his curiosity. As he stepped into the bustling kitchen, his eyes landed on her immediately. She was scrubbing a countertop with the same intensity she seemed to bring to everything. He cleared his throat, and Clara looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. "Good morning," he said, attempting a casual tone. "Morning," Clara replied, clearly wary. She resumed her cleaning, but her movements were more deliberate now, as though she was bracing for another confrontation. I wanted to. Alexander paused, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. Apologize. For last night. Clara stopped mid-scrub and turned to face him fully. Apologize, she repeated, disbelief coloring her tone. Yes, Alexander said, his voice firmer now. I was out of line. It wasn't fair to speak to you like that. Clara studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. Thank you, she said simply, then turned back to her work. Alexander stood there, uncertain what to say next. He wasn't used to his attempts at charm falling flat. Do you always work this hard? He asked, grasping for a way to keep the conversation going. Clara let out a soft laugh, though it lacked humor. When you've got bills to pay, there's no such thing as too hard. Bills? Alexander asked, genuinely curious now. What kind of bills could someone like you have? Clara's hand stilled, and she turned to him with a look that was both sharp and tired. Someone like me? She echoed. You mean someone who doesn't have a safety net? Someone who's one missed paycheck away from losing everything? Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but found he didn't have the words. Clara shook her head and returned to her task. That's what I thought, she murmured. For the second time in as many days, Alexander walked away from her feeling unsteady, her words chipping away at the carefully constructed world he'd always taken for granted. Meanwhile, Victoria had not forgotten the incident at the party. Later that afternoon, she summoned Clara to her study, her tone clipped as she gave the order. Clara stood nervously before the grand oak desk, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Victoria regarded her with a cold, calculating gaze, her manicured fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished wood. I've noticed you've been drawing attention, Victoria began, her voice as sharp as the jewelry adorning her neck. That's not what we pay you for. Clara swallowed hard, her heart pounding. I didn't mean to cause any trouble, ma'am. Trouble or not, you've overstepped, Victoria said icily. Your place is in the background. Quiet, efficient, invisible. Do I make myself clear? Clara's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she nodded. Yes, ma'am. Victoria leaned back in her chair, satisfied. Good. Now get back to work. Clara left the study feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. She had worked hard to keep her head down, to avoid confrontations like this. But something about Victoria's tone, her assumption of superiority, made Clara's resolve harden. She wouldn't let people like Victoria to define her worth. Over the next few days, Alexander found himself seeking out excuses to cross paths with Clara. He told himself it was to better understand her perspective, an exercise in personal growth. But the truth was, he found her strength and honesty refreshing in a world filled with sycophants and shallow conversations. One evening, he caught her sitting on a bench in the estate's garden, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Without thinking, he approached her. You look tired, he said softly. Clara glanced up, startled, then shrugged. It's been a long day. Alexander hesitated before sitting beside her. Do you ever get time for yourself? Clara let out a short laugh. Time for myself doesn't pay rent or feed my siblings. Siblings? Alexander asked, genuinely surprised. Clara nodded. 2 younger brothers. I've been taking care of them since our parents passed. This job helps me keep a roof over their heads. Alexander was quiet for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. That's a lot. Clara smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. It is, but it's worth it. Alexander looked at her, seeing her in a new light. You're stronger than most people I know. Clara's expression softened, and for the first time, she looked at him without the guarded distance she usually maintained. Thanks, she said quietly. That means more than you know. As they sat in the fading light of the garden, Alexander felt something shift within him. Clara wasn't just a maid or a passing curiosity. She was someone extraordinary, someone who challenged him to see the world differently. In the days that followed, Alexander couldn't help but replay his conversations with Clara. Her resilience and selflessness stayed with him, challenging his beliefs and forcing him to confront parts of himself he had long ignored. He began to notice things he had previously taken for granted, the faces of the staff who worked tirelessly around him, the sacrifices they made, the lives they led outside the walls of his privilege. Clara, meanwhile, did her best to keep her head down. She couldn't afford distractions, not when her brothers needed her. But Alexander's sudden change in demeanor was hard to ignore. He wasn't as sharp-tongued or dismissive, and his questions carried genuine curiosity rather than mockery. Against her better judgment, she found herself softening toward him. One afternoon, while Clara was tending to the estate's flower beds, Alexander approached her with a small bouquet of freshly picked roses in hand. Clara looked up from her work, squinting against the sun. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone wary. "I thought these might brighten your day," Alexander said, holding out the bouquet. Clara raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "And what do you expect in return?" "Nothing," Alexander said quickly. "I just thought you might like them." Clara hesitated before taking the bouquet, her fingers brushing against his. "Thank you," she said quietly, her cheeks tinged with color. "But you don't have to do things like this." "I know," Alexander said, sitting on the edge of the flower bed. "But I want to." Clara shook her head, smiling faintly. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you," Alexander replied, his voice soft. For a moment, the world seemed to still. The barriers between their worlds felt thinner, almost fragile. But Clara, ever practical, broke the silence first. "Shouldn't you be in a meeting or something?" she asked, her tone light. Alexander laughed, the sound surprising both of them. "Probably. But I think I'll survive." Victoria, however, was less amused by Alexander's newfound interest in Clara. She had been watching him closely, her suspicion growing with each passing day. When she saw him laughing with Clara in the garden, her patience snapped. That evening, she summoned Alexander to her study. He arrived reluctantly, knowing what was coming. "Care to explain what's been going on?" Victoria demanded, her tone icy. "I don't know what you mean," Alexander said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Don't play coy with me," Victoria snapped. "I've seen the way you've been spending time with that, but—" "Her name is Clara," Alexander said firmly. "And yes, I've been spending time with her." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Do you have any idea how that looks? Associating with someone like her." "Someone like her?" Alexander repeated, his voice rising. "You mean someone who works harder than anyone in this house? Someone who's sacrificed everything for her family?" "Don't romanticize her struggle," Victoria said coldly. "She's not one of us, Alexander. And she never will be." Alexander straightened, his jaw tight. "Maybe that's a good thing." Victoria stared at him, stunned into silence for a moment. But when she spoke again, her voice was steely. "You're making a mistake. And I won't let you tarnish this family's reputation." "Your reputation is all you care about," Alexander shot back. "But I'm done living by your rules." He turned and walked out, his heart pounding. For the first time, he felt like he was finally standing up for what he believed in. But the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Clara, unaware of the confrontation, continued her work as usual. But the tension in the estate was palpable, and she could sense that something had shifted. When Alexander found her later that evening, his expression was both determined and vulnerable. "I told my mother about us," he said without preamble. Clara froze, her heart racing. "About us?" she echoed. "There is no us, Alexander." "There could be," he said, stepping closer. "If you'd let there be." Clara shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand what you're asking. Your world and mine, they don't mix." "Maybe they should," Alexander said. "Maybe it's time someone like me stopped pretending we're better than the people who keep this place running." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with both hope and fear. "Alexander." He reached for her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to fight for this. For you." Clara hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to believe him, to trust that his feelings were genuine. But the weight of their differences loomed large, casting a shadow over the fragile connection they had built. "I need time," she said finally, pulling her hand away. "Time to figure out if this is something I can handle." Alexander nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." The days passed, and while Alexander respected Clara's request for space, he found himself growing increasingly restless. He couldn't stop thinking about her, the way she carried herself with quiet strength, her determination in the face of adversity, and the honesty in her words that had cut through his carefully constructed facade. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt truly vulnerable, and it terrified him. Clara, too, wrestled with her emotions. She knew Alexander's feelings were genuine, but she couldn't shake the fear that their worlds were simply too different. At night, as she sat in her small apartment, She would look at the photograph of her late parents and wonder what they would have advised. They had always taught her to value honesty and hard work, but that also cautioned her against chasing dreams that felt out of reach. One evening, as Clara walked home from her night school class, she found herself deep in thought. She had been saving every penny she could to put herself through school, juggling work, and caring for her siblings. But Alexander's presence in her life had stirred something new, a longing for a different kind of future. She wasn't sure if it was possible, but the idea of letting someone in, of not carrying the weight of her world alone, was tempting. Meanwhile, Victoria was far from idle. She had no intention of letting Clara become a permanent fixture in Alexander's life. She reached out to her network of influential friends, seeking any dirt she could find on Clara. When that proved fruitless, she resorted to intimidation, summoning Clara to her study under the guise of discussing her employment. Clara entered the study with trepidation, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Victoria sat behind a massive desk, her expression as cold and unyielding as ever. "You wanted to see me, ma'am?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Victoria regarded her with thinly veiled disdain. "Yes, I thought it was time we had a little chat." Clara said nothing, waiting for Victoria to continue. "My son seems to have taken an interest in you," Victoria began, her tone dripping with condescension. "I want to make it clear that this infatuation of his is nothing more than a passing whim. Men like Alexander don't settle for women like you." Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high. "With all due respect, ma'am, Alexander's choices are his own." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Let me be perfectly clear. You are a distraction, a temporary amusement at best. If you care about your future and your family's future, you'll end this nonsense before it goes any further." Clara's breath caught, but she refused to let Victoria see her falter. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm merely offering you some friendly advice," Victoria said with a thin smile. "Walk away now, and I might be inclined to provide you with a generous severance package. Enough to pay for your schooling and ensure your siblings are taken care of." Clara stared at her, torn between anger and despair. She wanted to tell Victoria where to shove her offer, but the thought of her brothers and their future weighed heavily on her mind. "I'll think about it," Clara said finally, her voice tight. Victoria leaned back in her chair, satisfied. "See that you do." That night, Clara lay awake, her mind racing. She thought about Victoria's words, about the offer that could solve so many of her problems. But every time she considered accepting it, Alexander's face would flash in her mind, his sincerity, his willingness to defy his mother, and the quiet way he had promised to fight for her. The next morning, she made her decision. Clara found Alexander in the garden, pacing restlessly among the roses. He looked up when he saw her, his expression softening. "Clara," he said, taking a step toward her. "I wasn't sure if you'd come." Clara hesitated, her heart pounding. "I need to talk to you." "Of course," Alexander said, his voice filled with concern. "What's wrong?" Clara took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Your mother offered me money to leave, to walk away from you." Alexander's eyes darkened, anger flickering across his face. "She what?" "I didn't accept it," Clara said quickly. "But I need you to understand something, Alexander. Thus, it's not going to be easy. Your world, your family, they're not just obstacles. They're walls that are built to keep people like me out." Alexander stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Then we'll tear them down, Clara. Together." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she managed a small smile. "You really mean that?" "I've never meant anything more in my life," Alexander said, taking her hands in his. "You're worth it, Clara, and I won't let anyone tell me otherwise." For the first time in weeks, Clara felt the weight on her shoulders lighten. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, standing with Alexander in the garden, she felt hope. In the following days, the tension in the estate grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Clara continued her duties with the same quiet diligence, but she could feel the weight of Victoria's watchful gaze. Alexander, on the other hand, became more defiant. His interactions with Clara were no longer discreet. He sought her out in broad daylight, as if daring anyone, especially his mother, to challenge him. One afternoon, Clara was tending to the flower beds when Alexander approached her, his steps purposeful. She glanced up, her heart skipping a beat at the sight of him. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. "I don't care," Alexander replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "We can't keep pretending nothing is happening." Clara sighed, setting down the pruning shears. Alexander, your mother isn't going to let this go. She's already tried to bribe me once. What's next? She doesn't control my life, Alexander said, crossing his arms. And I'm tired of letting her think she does. Clara looked at him, her expression a mix of admiration and worry. It's not just about you. She's made it very clear that she sees me as a problem. You're not a problem, Alexander said, stepping closer. You're the best thing that's happened to me in a long time. Clara felt her resolve wavering, but she held her ground. I don't want to be the reason you and your family fall apart. Alexander's jaw tightened. If they can't accept the choices I make, that's on them, not you. Clara studied him, searching for any hint of doubt. But his eyes were steady, his conviction unwavering. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could face this together. Victoria, however, was far from ready to concede. When she discovered that Alexander had been spending more time with Clara, she summoned him to her study. He arrived with a determined expression, bracing himself for the storm he knew was coming. Alexander, Victoria began, her tone sharp. This nonsense has gone on long enough. If you're referring to Clara, it's not nonsense, Alexander replied, his voice steady. And it's not going to stop. Victoria's eyes narrowed. You're willing to throw away everything we've built for some maid? She's not just a maid, Alexander said, his voice rising. She's a person, a kind, hard-working, incredible person who deserves far better than the way you've treated her. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. You're being naive. This infatuation will pass, and when it does, you'll regret alienating your family. I'd rather alienate my family than lose her, Alexander shot back. Because for the first time in my life, I found someone who makes me want to be better. And I'm not going to let you take that away from me. Victoria stared at him, stunned by the passion in his voice. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. But then her expression hardened. Fine, she said coldly. If that's how you feel, you can have your little romance. But don't expect me to stand by and watch you ruin your life. Alexander met her gaze, his resolve unwavering. You're wrong. Loving her won't ruin my life. It'll make it worth living. He turned and walked out, leaving Victoria alone in her study, her hands trembling with suppressed rage. Later that evening, Claire was surprised to find Alexander waiting for her near the staff quarters. He looked tired but determined, his eyes softening when he saw her. What are you doing here? She asked, glancing around nervously. I needed to see you, he said, his voice quiet. I told my mother everything. About how I feel about us. Clara's heart raced. And she doesn't approve, Alexander admitted. But I don't care. I'm done letting her control my life. Clara hesitated, her emotions warring within her. She wanted to believe him, to trust that they could overcome the odds. But the weight of their differences, of the obstacles they faced, was hard to ignore. I'm scared, Alexander, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. What if this doesn't work? What if it all falls apart? Alexander reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. Then we'll pick up the pieces together. But I'm not giving up on you, Clara. Not now, not ever. For the first time in weeks, Clara allowed herself to smile, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. Okay, she said softly. Let's try. Alexander's face lit up, and he pulled her into a gentle embrace. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the estate, they felt a glimmer of hope. The days that followed were a mix of quiet defiance and cautious optimism. Alexander and Clara's relationship, though fragile, began to take shape. They found stolen moments in the garden, exchanged hushed conversations in quiet corners, and discovered a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural despite their vastly different worlds. But the estate buzzed with whispers. The other staff noticed the stolen glances and lingering touches, and while some were supportive, others were wary. Victoria's disapproval hung over them like a dark cloud, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before she made her next move. One afternoon, Claire was in the kitchen, rolling dough for the estate's upcoming dinner party. Mia, a fellow staff member and one of the few who had become a confidant, leaned against the counter, watching her with a knowing smile. You've got it bad, Mia teased, her voice low enough to avoid the prying ears of others. Clara glanced up, a faint blush creeping up her cheeks. It's not like that. Mia raised an eyebrow. Oh, really? So the billionaire CEO who keeps sneaking off to talk to you is just being friendly? Clara sighed, setting down the rolling pin. It's complicated. Love always is, Mia said with a shrug. But if anyone can handle it, it's you. Clara smiled faintly, grateful for Mia's support. Thanks, Mia. Don't mention it, Mia said, giving her a wink before returning to her tasks. Meanwhile, Alexander was grappling with his own challenges. His decision to stand by Clara had put him at odds with his mother, and the tension between them was palpable. Victoria had grown colder, her disdain for Clara and Alexander's choices seeping into every interaction. One evening, as Alexander returned to his quarters after a long day at work, he found a note slipped under his door. It was from Victoria, summoning him to her study. He entered the room cautiously, bracing himself for another confrontation. Victoria stood by the window, her posture rigid as she stared out into the night. "You're making a mistake, Alexander," she said without turning to face him. "Good evening to you too, Mother," Alexander replied, his tone tinged with sarcasm. Victoria turned, her eyes hard. "This isn't a joke. Your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for this family." Alexander crossed his arms, meeting her gaze. "The only consequence I care about is losing someone who matters to me." Victoria stepped closer, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. "Do you even hear yourself? She's a maid, Alexander. What could she possibly offer you? More than this life ever has," Alexander shot back. "She's kind, selfless, and honest. She sees the world for what it is, not for what it can give her. And maybe that's exactly what I need." Victoria's face hardened. "If you choose her, you're choosing to turn your back on everything your father and I built." Alexander's jaw clenched. "Maybe what you built isn't worth holding on to." Victoria stared at him, stunned into silence. For the first time, she realized that her son was no longer the compliant child she had shaped. He was his own person now, and there was nothing she could do to change that. While Alexander and Victoria's relationship frayed, Clara focused on her goals. She continued her night classes, pouring every ounce of energy into her studies. Her brothers, unaware of the drama unfolding at the estate, cheered her on, their unwavering faith in her giving her strength. One evening, as Clara sat at the dining table in her modest apartment, reviewing her notes, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Alexander standing there, a small bouquet of wildflowers in hand. "Wildflowers this time," Clara said with a smile, stepping aside to let him in. "They reminded me of you," Alexander said, setting them on the table. "Beautiful, strong, and grounded." Clara's smile softened, and she gestured for him to sit. "What's on your mind?" Alexander hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "My mother isn't going to stop, Clara. She's made that very clear." Clara nodded, her expression serious. "I know, but that doesn't change how I feel." Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and determination. "I don't deserve you." Clara laughed softly. "You're probably right. But we're here now, and I'm willing to see where this goes." Alexander reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "So am I." As the weeks passed, Clara and Alexander's bond deepened. They continued to carve out moments of connection despite the mounting pressure from Victoria and the ever-watchful eyes of the estate's staff. Their relationship, though unconventional, grew stronger with every shared glance and every whispered conversation. But Victoria wasn't one to stand idle. If Alexander refused to see reason, she decided, perhaps it was time to show Clara exactly how out of place she was in their world. One evening, Victoria hosted a grand dinner party at the estate, inviting influential figures from her social circle. The guests arrived in their finest attire, the air buzzing with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Clara, assigned to help serve, moved silently among the crowd, doing her best to remain invisible. Victoria, however, had other plans. Midway through the evening, as the guests gathered in the drawing room, Victoria clinked her glass to draw their attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily over the chatter. "I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge someone who has recently become quite a topic of interest in this household." Clara froze where she stood, the tray in her hand suddenly feeling unbearably heavy. She knew instinctively that Victoria's words were meant for her. "This young woman," Victoria continued, gesturing toward Clara, "has shown remarkable tenacity and dedication in her work here. She's become something of a fixture in our lives." The guests turned to look at Clara, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to thinly veiled judgment. Clara felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her head high, refusing to let Victoria see her falter. And yet, Victoria said, her tone growing colder, it's important to remember that some boundaries are meant to be respected. After all, knowing one's place is the mark of true character. The room fell silent, the weight of Victoria's words hanging heavily in the air. Clara's grip tightened on the tray, but she forced herself to remain composed. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the room, her steps steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. Alexander found Clara in the garden later that night, her shoulders hunched as she sat on the edge of the fountain. She didn't look up when he approached, but he could see the tension in her posture. "Clara," he said softly, sitting beside her. "I'm so sorry." She shook her head, her voice tight with emotion. "You don't need to apologize for her." "Yes, I do," Alexander said firmly. "She had no right to treat you like that." Clara turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She's right, though, isn't she? I don't belong here." "Don't say that," Alexander said, taking her hand. "You belong wherever you want to be." Clara pulled her hand away, her voice breaking. "It's not that simple, Alexander. Your world and mine, they don't mix. And pretending they do is only going to make things harder for both of us." Alexander's chest tightened, but he refused to back down. "We can make it work, Clara. I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to fight for us." Clara looked at him, her heart aching. "I don't want to be the reason you lose your family." "You're not the reason," Alexander said, his voice fierce. "My mother's pride and her refusal to change are the problem, not you." Clara searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt. But his eyes were steady, his determination unwavering. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained somber. "Okay," she said quietly, "but I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Alexander said. "Promise me that if it ever gets to be too much, you'll tell me," Clara said. "Don't hold on just to prove a point. If this doesn't work, I need to know you'll be honest with me." Alexander nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. "I promise." Despite their resolve, the challenges continued to mount. Victoria's disapproval became more overt, and the whispers among the staff grew louder. Clara began to wonder if she had made the right decision, even as her feelings for Alexander deepened. One day, while Clara was cleaning the library, Victoria entered the room without warning. Clara straightened immediately, bracing herself for another confrontation. "You're still here," Victoria said, her tone laced with disdain. "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied, keeping her voice steady. Victoria studied her for a moment before speaking again. "Do you really think this infatuation will last? That my son will give up everything for someone like you?" Clara met her gaze, her own eyes sharp despite the fear gnawing at her heart. "I think Alexander knows what he wants, ma'am, and I trust him to make his own decisions." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see about that." Victoria's challenge hung in the air like a storm cloud, but Clara didn't let it sway her. She returned to her work, her resolve stronger than ever. She was determined not to let Victoria's attempts to undermine her relationship with Alexander succeed. And while the days were long and filled with tension, she found strength in the small moments she shared with him, stolen glances, whispered conversations, and the warmth of his unwavering support. Alexander, too, was unrelenting. He began to take more concrete steps to separate himself from his mother's control. He moved important business operations away from the estate, started delegating more responsibilities to his trusted team, and even began looking for a place of his own. It was clear that he was not only fighting for Clara, but also reclaiming his independence. The turning point came during another of Victoria's lavish dinner parties. This time, Alexander had a plan. As the guests mingled and admired the estate's grandeur, he stood at the center of the room, tapping a glass to draw their attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but commanding, "thank you for joining us tonight. Before we continue, I'd like to share something important." Victoria, who had been chatting with a group of influential friends, froze mid-sentence. Her eyes narrowed as she turned to face her son. Alexander continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "For too long, I've allowed appearances and expectations to dictate my life. But I've come to realize that true happiness isn't found in wealth or status. It's found in the people who stand by you, no matter what." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, all eyes fixed on him. "I want you all to meet someone who's taught me more about strength, resilience, and kindness than anyone else I've ever known," Alexander said, turning toward the doorway. Clara stepped into the room, her hands trembling but her head held high. She wore a simple dress, one of the few nice things she owned, and her hair was pulled back neatly. Despite her nerves, she radiated a quiet confidence. "This is Clara," Alexander said, his voice filled with pride. "She's not just someone I care about, she's someone I admire deeply. And I won't stand by while she's treated as anything less than the remarkable person she is." The room erupted into whispers, some guests exchanging shocked glances while others smiled in approval. Clara's heart pounded, but she kept her gaze steady, refusing to let the weight of their judgment crush her. Victoria, however, was furious. She stepped forward, her face a mask of barely concealed anger. "Alexander, this is highly inappropriate," she hissed. "No, Mother," Alexander said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "What's inappropriate is the way you've treated Clara, and the way you've tried to control my life. That ends now." Victoria stared at him, composure slipping for the first time. But before she could respond, one of the guests spoke up. "Bravo, Alexander," an older woman said, clapping her hands. "It's about time someone in this family stood for something real." Others joined in, their applause filling the room. Victoria, seeing the tide turn against her, took a step back, her expression unreadable. After the party, Alexander found Clara in the garden, sitting by the fountain where they had shared so many conversations. She looked up as he approached, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Alexander replied, sitting beside her. "You deserve to be seen, Clara. And I'm done hiding how much you mean to me." Clara smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You're impossible, you know that? And you're extraordinary," Alexander said, taking her hand. "I want to build a life with you, a life where we're equals, where we fight for each other no matter what." Clara's smile widened, and she leaned into him, her heart full. "I'd like that," she whispered. In the weeks that followed, Victoria's resistance softened, not because she approved of Clara, but because she realized she couldn't change Alexander's mind. Slowly, grudgingly, she began to accept their relationship, and while things were far from perfect, the icy walls between them began to thaw. Clara continued her studies, graduating from her night classes with honors. Alexander was there, cheering the loudest as she accepted her certificate. Together, they started a small foundation to support underprivileged workers, combining Clara's compassion with Alexander's resources. Their journey wasn't without challenges, but they faced them together, their love and determination growing stronger with each passing day. Years later, as they walked through the garden hand in hand, Clara paused by the fountain, her gaze soft. "Do you remember when we sat here, unsure of everything?" Alexander smiled, squeezing her hand. "I remember thinking that no matter what happened, it would be worth it if I had you." Clara leaned into him, her heart full. "It was worth it," she said, "every moment." And as they stood there, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the garden, they knew that their love had not only bridged the gap between their worlds, but it also built something stronger and more enduring than either of them had ever imagined.